as Marv Levy said, where would you rather be than right here, right now?
That's right. And I was mentioning earlier that I got PTSD coming back into the law office since I got out of it last December, or December 2019, and took me probably 3 or 4 months to shred every file I had from 40-some years worth of employment and work. And my wife, Wiki, helped me, and she was pulling off little yellow Post-it notes, and she said she never wanted to see a Post-it note or a paper clip again, and too many paper cuts.
Was that a hard decision to make, David? You are my age. We're 70 area.
Well, you're much younger than I am. You know, you've been able to maintain your vitality for a much longer period of time.
Was that hard though? I mean, if you're.
You know, I don't think so, because a number of factors. You started interviewing people like Sam Price Sr., who said Walter Miller was in the office at 80-some years of age and couldn't do anything else. He couldn't travel, but he came into the office every day because that was easy to do for him as an attorney. Doug Spoto saw me on the street a year or two after he had retired, and he said, "David, don't take too long. Don't wait too long. Get out when you can." My wife had retired 5 years ago, before I was even out, and after 40-some years of taking care of everybody else's problems, I felt like I really needed to move on and try to do something else in life. Now, it was a great experience, but as my English Shakespeare professor at Hobart College said, when I told her I was going into law, she said, "Oh, that's too bad. I thought you would do something more interesting than that dull thing."
Was there anything in your background, your mom, your dad, that kind of kicked you into an interest in the law?
Well, I think that when I first went off to Hobart College, I was hoping to become an aeronautical engineer. And then while I was sitting in physics lab on a Wednesday afternoon for 4 or 5 hours with the slide rule before computers, and all of the people were over playing Frisbee in the quad and screaming for the lacrosse team and having a great time. And I was looking at my professor, who I don't know if he ever uttered a happy word in his life or smiled at all. I kind of said, well, maybe I should try something else. So I started to think about other things. After going through a year of required courses at Hobart, you know, Latin and Western Civ and all of that stuff, I thought, well, try English. We had some really good English teachers, so I really enjoyed the language. I enjoyed going back and reading Beowulf and all the old types of language and really studying it and getting into Shakespeare. Had a course or two with Professor Joe DeGangi on constitutional law. And I said, well, maybe I can start thinking about something for a career, since my parents are paying for this education. They want me to work when I get out. You know, I need to do something. My mother started to encourage me to try something like the law. And then I had an opportunity to go to a meeting. My uncle, Gordon Stapleton, was the head tax person at the Cleveland Cliffs Holding Company, which was a international company in Cleveland that owned all the freighters that ran up and down the Great Lakes and would bring in all the commodities into Cleveland for the steel factories. He was in the Commerce Building, downtown Cleveland, and up above them, a few floors up, happened to be Jones Day Law Firm. Yeah. And so he interacted with them on a regular basis, and he said, let me try to get you a meeting with one of the guys. So I said, okay. So he got me a meeting with a luncheon meeting where he and I met the head constitutional law attorney partner for Jones Day, and we went up to their executive luncheon room and had a great time talking with, I don't know, have any understanding why this man would ever meet with a little schmo like me, you know, the junior from Hobart College, but he did. and that was very, very gracious of him. Law firm that Scalia came out of. I don't know what years he came out of Jones Day. Do you remember offhand? So after that, I said, well, you know, maybe it's something I can try. And so we had a couple of guys from, one guy from Jamestown, a couple of guys from Hobart that went down to University of Richmond, in Richmond. And so I just followed them. Hobart had been my uncle's college after World War II. Eddie Franks, if you remember Eddie, went over to Hobart. Scott Pugh from Faulkner went over to Hobart. Scott came down to University of Richmond before I did, the year before. And so we just kind of followed everybody else. And my wife and I got married right out of college. We went down to Richmond together and decided, well, maybe we better get married. So we came back, gave my parents 2 weeks, got married, and went back down and tried to start to think of what we wanted to do in life, really. I mean, we're just kids. You know, when you're 21, 22 years old, you're just a kid. So hung around down there for 3 years. She finished up 1 semester at Edinburgh in teaching and came down and worked in the Richmond City Schools as a part-time substitute while I was going to school. And when I came out of Richmond, we were trying to think of where we wanted to live. You know, in those days, you were just kind of looking around the country and saying, well, what do we want to do? Do we want to have a family? Do we want to live here? Do we want to live there? And decided to, I came up and interviewed with a guy over at Erie, PA, a guy by the name of Lenny Ambrose, who was a big criminal defense lawyer in Erie, did a lot of high-profile murder cases over in Erie. And I sat down with him and interviewed with him because I thought maybe I should go to Erie. Wiki had been down at Edinburgh. So I'm sitting down and talking to Lenny. He looks at me and he says, you know, why don't you, you know, the thing you should do is just go out and open up your own practice. And I said, well, you know, I'm up for anything, so why not? So decided to go back to Richmond. We kind of like the South a little bit, and bought a 70-page book from the American Bar Association on how to set up your own practice. You know, what you need to do for billing and time and keeping track of time. And at that point, I was very fortunate to find a gentleman in the Mutual building in downtown Richmond, which was probably a 12-story building. Old Southern gentleman by the name of Richard Moncure, who allowed me to come in and pay him $200 in rent and take one of his spare offices and use his telephone systems. He had a secretary there that acted as a receptionist. And at that point in time, we were fortunate that the Virginia Bar Association had just started to create a lawyer referral service. So I was able to get a number of cases from them. Wiki was substitute teaching periodically here and there, and I would spend time trying to learn how to practice law. Richard was a real estate attorney. Lawyer referral stuff was pretty much litigation type of stuff. I was able to get on a list of criminal defense referral attorneys for the U.S. District Court, which was a block down the street from me, because my trial tactics teacher happened to be a guy by the name of Robert Marriage, who was the U.S. District Court judge from Long Island, who ended up in Richmond marrying a wealthy girl, and who had integrated the schools down in Richmond, much to his chagrin, with people burning crosses on his front lawn and everything else. So I used to go over and watch the true lawyers, because I was just a graduate with no experience, and watch to see how they did things. We also had the Court of Appeals in Richmond. So I could go up there and I could watch really fine attorneys do their arguments, try their cases, and listen to the judges, who were phenomenal. At that point in time, you had some excellent law firms downtown. You had Hunt and Williams, which is where Supreme Court Chief Justice Powell came out of. You had McGuire Woods and Battle, which provided associate professors to the University of Richmond for us to study under. One in particular, a guy by the name of Carl Davis, was our tax professor. Used to come to class impeccably dressed in phenomenal, beautiful looking Italian ties and suits, and he was on the board of trustees of the University of Richmond, promoting gifting, charitable gifting for the university. Had arranged for the A.H. Robbins company to donate $50 million in a matching grant to the university the year I came down, that they used to start building the law school additions and to build many of the phenomenal buildings down at Richmond. And Davis was an interesting guy. He would, we were living just north of Richmond at that point in time, and I was driving in during the summertime, and his rule was that the judges require you to be in court on time. If you don't show up on time, then you're out of luck. So my rule, Professor Davis, is that I'm starting at 8 o'clock in the morning, and if it's 8 o'clock and 5 seconds after 8 o'clock, the door is locked and you don't get in the classroom. So we all learned very quickly that you had to be in court on time and you had to respect the judge. Very different time in Richmond, Virginia. Like I said, they were just opening up the school systems. We had to wear three-piece suits when it came to going and taking our bar exam. One day it was 95 degrees. I was walking across the intersection in downtown Richmond, and Judge Marriage comes across with a couple of his buddies, and I've got my coat open and my vest open. I'm dying. I'm sweating to death. And he starts yelling at me and says that, you know, you're supposed to have a better image than that as an attorney. Put, you know, button back up. So, and then 2 years later, I ended up up in Buffalo taking a New York bar, and everybody walks in sandals and shorts and you know, some sort of t-shirts. It was an interesting dichotomy between the culture down in Richmond and the culture up here. So we did that for a while. And
criminal work principally?
Primarily criminal work. I would go be appointed to handle some type of contraband, type of possession by some of the prisoners down at the Petersburg Federal Penitentiary. So I'd have to go down there and walk into the penitentiary. And also in Richmond, I had some of the criminal defense stuff. The prison in Richmond, the state prison, was right across one of the bridges coming across the James River. You could drive through and you could see the prisoners hanging on the bars, looking out the windows. I mean, just really scary. So the first time I went in there, I went into a building where the opening was as tall as your building here, and I was scared to death. I mean, I'm a 22-year-old, and walking in, and it really shook me up, because when I walked through, suddenly I realized that there was a courtyard and prisoners were walking all around the courtyard. You know, I thought they were all going to be in their cells, and I'd be protected, you know, sitting down with them in some sort of a conference room, but it was different. But I tell you, the Petersburg Federal Penitentiary was far nicer, much nicer to facility to be around for the people that were there. So we did a lot of that stuff. We had some civil referrals. I had a Black Baptist church that was referred to me, where the congregants wanted to sue the minister. Somehow the minister had ended up owning about 40 houses, rental houses, and the church was kind of poor, and people started to think after a while that, well, maybe all the donations that we're giving to the church are going to some source or some purpose that is not truly our religious denomination. And so they hired me to sue this guy. So one of my first trials, actually it might have been my first trial, I sued this guy. We went into the circuit court in Richmond, Virginia, which was a beautiful new building at that time, and I walked into the court, and I walk in, and there's my black congregation sitting behind me.
Yeah.
Over here is the defense lawyer, who's some black guy. The minister is black. I look over, I got a black bailiff, and in walks the judge, who was a black guy. Yeah. And I'm cross-examining the minister, and my congregants are commenting as we go along. And that was a fascinating time period. It really was. When you're young and you're doing that kind of stuff, everything is kind of hardwired into you in terms of the exciting new challenges and experiences. So after going through those experiences, we decided that Wiki wasn't really going to get a job down in Richmond. That was something that she felt that she could continue and enjoy. So we looked around, and one of my Richmond law alumni colleagues was coming back out of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he let me know that there was a job available up in Front Royal that he was leaving. And so I went up and I interviewed with a guy by the name of John McCune in Front Royal, and John brought my wife and I up for a dinner at his house, which was in Luray, about 30 miles south of Front Royal. And we were on the back deck and looking up at the Blue Ridge Mountains in the summertime, and this giant full moon came up over the top of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and it was the most amazing moon I've ever seen in my life. And I said, well, we could probably try this for a while. So we stayed there for about 9 months, bought a house from a really nice farmer and his wife who were raising beef cattle that were deciding to move out of their house and build a new facility up on a hill overlooking everything in Luray. And I drove back and forth to Front Royal to do a general practice with my boss, who was the district attorney in the Luray County, and also doing defense work in the Front Royal County, Page County and the other county. And my wife, who was not certified to teach in Virginia, would drive over the Massanutten Mountain and go over to the University of, or over at Harrisonburg, to the university there, and picked up a few extra credits to get certified in Virginia. Very nice people out there in the valley, a whole nother different culture than what we had experienced in Richmond. No central schools until about a year before we got there. And after about 9-10 months, we started to think about having a family. Where would we want to be? So we went up on the Massanutten Mountain and looked out, or actually the Blue Ridge Mountain, and looked out to the west over several mountain ranges and talked about where we wanted to be, and thought about coming back to Jamestown, actually to Chautauqua County, for access to Chautauqua Lake and to raise a family in the school systems here, because as you know, we all had a great time in our school systems here. They were really phenomenal at that point in time. You were a big football guy. I did primarily music and theater. My wife was in music. And we were hopeful that maybe things would continue in that way. But we ended up out in Asheville with our kids going up to Chautauqua Lake Central School. So at that point, forgive me for droning on here. I'm waiting for the moderator to jump in and ask me questions.
Okay, you get back here. You make a decision, as many people did, where they want to live. Mm-hmm. Location. You chose for family reasons to come back here, but at the same time, professionally, you're a lawyer. And at the same time, you got to figure, well, where am I going to work and how am I going to work? And did the allure of working with the public defenders or that work? Because that was your background. I mean, you did a lot of litigation, defense work. Was that a draw too?
Yeah, you know, I felt comfortable in the courtroom. It was a little bit exciting to go into the courtroom. I walked into my federal district court judge trial tactics teacher down in Richmond as we were finishing up our trial tactics course, and I said, I'm not here to lobby for a particular grade, but would you give me a recommendation? So he wrote me a glowing recommendation saying that I would be very successful in this endeavor for whoever might hire me. So when you came back to Jamestown, small town, hard to get hired by anybody because nobody's got the money to hire, you know, with any kind of a living wage and pay health insurance. So I interviewed with a number of different firms. You know, everybody was over the Wellman building at that point in time. You know, you're talking to Bill Cass. You know, I'm talking to the Wrights. I'm talking to Lou Ledestro, everybody. And luckily at that point in time, Lanny Sheffield had come out of Jeff Weesey's office, and he and Ed Fagan had created an office over at the Westbridge building as a partnership. And they were willing to bring me on for not a lot of money. So I decided, well, I got to start somewhere, so I started there. And during that time period, after a few months, Ed was working his way through developing his criminal defense abilities, working his way into the public defender's arena. And I got hired by Richard Slater, I believe at that point in time. It was like 1978, 1979. I think Richard left after that for a few years, and then Ed was coming in. So he and Ed were going back and forth on the public defender's thing. Right. So I did criminal defense work for the public defender. I did some private stuff for Fagan and Sheffield, but they had a general practice. So with Lanny, I was learning how to do real estate, and I was learning how to do bankruptcy, learning how to send proceed checks to Doug Spoto that were in his name as attorney for rather than in the name of his client, which upsets him greatly.
How he gets his fee.
Right. So it was a fun time, and Wiki started to work up in the Chautauqua area, eventually got a job as a teacher at Chautauqua Central Schools. I did want to mention one thing about Cleveland, however. I was born in Cleveland, and my family went back and forth with every economic cycle to Cleveland. My dad was born here in Jamestown, and we had a long history here in Jamestown. He and his brother and sister moved out to Cleveland after the war. Then he came back here to work as an engineer with the Office of General Services, building the buildings for Roswell and Fredonia State and all of those facilities. But my daughter, Jennifer, ended up going back to Cleveland because it was really the fourth largest law firm market in the country at that point in time, and ended up 40 years later working with Jones Day, for a few years, the people that had interviewed me. So that was pretty. It's a small world how things go around, and she's still out there with a different firm, but still out there. So, yeah.
Just for the record, what would your mom do? Was she?
My mom came into the area, went to Jamestown Business College, worked as a secretary down at Crescent Tool. Ended up working as an executive assistant secretary in the research department out of Carborundum down in Faulkner for quite a number of years. And then in, when we were 14 or 15 years of age, maybe in the middle 60s, my uncle, my dad's cousin, I should say, was a salesman for one of the metal manufacturing companies down in Faulkner, Jamestown Metal or something like that. And he had purchased, and his wife had been running the Lakewood Dairy Queen up in Lakewood. So my mom, they said, listen, we're getting older. We want to get out of the business. My mom, I think, wanted to get out of carborundum. And so they bought carborundum from my uncle, George Stapleton, and she ran the Dairy Queen.
Okay.
And that gave me an opportunity to jump on the bus here in Jamestown at the high school as I got out of the high school when I was 15 or 16, and take the bus up to Lakewood and work at the Dairy Queen and learn how to clean machines and pass out ice cream cones, and eventually they made it into a food service with the Brazier Burger, and learn how to take care of the garbage and do everything else. So
It's a skill set.
a skill set. And my children also were, kind of insisted that they go into food service so that they could learn how difficult it is to make a minimum wage.
Right.
And that was a great situation for us. My dad bought a boat eventually, and I would go from the Dairy Queen up to what's now Smith Boys Marina. It used to be Maple Bay Marina. Jump on a boat and go out and water ski with Donnie Carlson from your ex-football buddy from Jamestown, and just had a really good time. So, and get paid a wage that I didn't deserve.
Yeah. And you knew the boss.
Yeah, right.
So you were with Fagan and Sheffield, but you did have some public defender time. Do you remember a trial or two that, here you are kind of learning the ropes, but all of a sudden you're foisted right in there? I mean, trial is the normal course of things for a public defender.
Well, I think the younger people who might be watching this at any point in time, whether it's my grandchildren or whomever, have to understand that it really is a lifelong learning process. And I had to spend 40 years of reinventing myself constantly, depending upon the economic climate, depending upon the nature of the laws that were being passed at that point in time, depending upon the nature of the clientele. The trial stuff, people threw you into things. One of the first things I remember is Richard must have thrown me into an appeal that was a murder case that Bruce Carpenter had tried at one point in time with an insanity defense. And some 80-year-old woman had been smothered to death by some young guy up in Dunkirk. And the jury had found him guilty, and Carpenter appealed. They gave me the appeal to handle, and I'd never been in the appellate court, had no training in the appellate court, had nobody to mentor me in appellate court practice, and looked through all the briefs, helped out a little bit. The briefs at that point in time for the district attorney's office were being created by a service for them downstate somewhere. I don't know if it was in New York City or Albany. We created our own brief. Nervous as hell, I went up to Rochester, stayed overnight at some hotel by the river, a couple of blocks away from the old appellate division facility. I got over there in this big giant room and listened to all kinds of appeals before me. I think Judge Dillon was the chief judge at that point in time. Got up, went to do my spiel, and the first thing out of the chief judge's mouth was, "Mr. Stapleton, is there any doubt that your client killed this person?" And I'm saying, what? What are you talking about, Judge? Why are you asking me that question? I'm here on an insanity defense, and you're asking me whether my guy killed her, and that was essentially the end of the appeal. Well, it's pretty obvious in the record that yeah, he killed her, but I mean that's not why we're here. So that was not a good taste in my mouth for appellate work. And I don't know throughout my career, the 3 or 4 times that I've been up there, that more than half the time I've come away happy about the nature of my experience based on my preparation and the people up there that are very gracious attorneys and the way that they approach arguments coming in. We did have some trials. I had not a lot of trials, but that's where I started to pick juries, was up there. And just vague recollections. I had Lee Town was the attorney, as the judge. And I had a case where I had some local guy here in Jamestown who was accused of throwing Molotov cocktails at somebody's house. Some really kind of a low-life type of guy here in Jamestown. Frank Bajano, I think, was assisting us in those days. I don't remember, it must have been, again, Slater must have been the public defender. We go in, we pick the jury. Ed was somehow involved, Ed Fagan, with administration. And he had encouraged me to start looking for expert witnesses. So we found a chemistry professor down at JCC to talk about the aspects of what really is the crime here, which is what were the chemicals, if anything, used in the bottles that were thrown. And we had the chemical reports about the analysis of all this stuff. The professor graciously agrees to come up to this trial with Lee Town handling it. I think Neil Robinson was the prosecutor at that point in time. And this guy rolls in his wheelchair. We get him up on the stand, and I start questioning him about, going on and on and on and on about the different chemical properties of what possibly could have been in the bottle versus what the law says the chemical properties had to be in that bottle in order for there to have been a crime that was created. And about 45 minutes to an hour into the event, we take a break. Judge Adam comes down, and he comes over to me and he says, "David, nobody gives a damn about what the chemical composition was inside that bottle, so move on with it." So I said, "Judge, it's my whole defense. What do you want me to do?" So I think my man was in fact, I think he was not only charged, but I think he was convicted. Later on, come to find out, he was charged and convicted of some sort of pedophilia with activities here in Jamestown. So I used to see him sitting 20 years later over in front of the Jamestown Municipal Building doing some kind of signage objecting to somebody, whether it was social services or somebody else. It was an interesting time. But the attorneys were excellent. Ed Fagan, it was fun to watch Ed work. We had an opportunity to go in and talk with Bob Sawyer at one point in time. Ed was involved with Sawyer in a number of different ways. We had Jerry Olson, who was accused of raping a girl who was riding her bicycle back from the Good Morning Farm back to Stowe, where she had been staying for the night. And Jerry was an interesting guy. Ed, at one point in time during that particular proceeding, there was a suppression hearing. We were spending a lot of time. Ed was cross-examining somebody, and at one point in time, maybe even the girl. I don't know why she would have been in the suppression hearing, but there was a long type of cross-examination going on, and Ed was just really grinding everybody down. And he was really being able to get down to the point where maybe perhaps for the lineup where they were trying to identify, that's what it was. The girl had gone into a lineup and had identified Jerry, essentially based on the squareness of his shoulders and how big he was. That's all that she remembered, poor girl, but that's all that she remembered. So about 2 hours into the proceeding, at about 11:30 in the morning, suddenly Leetown Adam just goes boom like that with his head and smacks the table right in front of us. I thought the guy was dead. I did happen to see Doug Spoto talk about that happening one other time, but I mean, I was just amazed that that had happened. I didn't know about this prior situation that Doug had talked about, but you know, all the EMTs come in and they take him out, and somehow he revives. And so that was kind of a scary moment. But Leetown was great. You used to walk into his chambers and he'd be laying there on his couch, you know, and he'd be playing cards otherwise on his table. And
Spittoon.
yeah, right. Always a character. Yeah. So that was fun.
You were working with Ed, and Ed's Fagan's relationship with the judge was probably not the smoothest. Did you observe much of that?
Well, other than Leetown going and smacking his head on the table during one of Ed's cross-examinations, I never saw the two of them really yell at each other, but you could tell that the judge didn't like to be pushed as much as Ed felt people Ed was we have an ethical obligation to be zealous advocates for our clients. And Ed was a zealous advocate for his client. And the judges like things a little bit more smooth, you know. And but I was talking to Judge Alessi over at City Court at one point in time during all of this. And he said, you know, I guess I was over I had a jury trial over there for a DWI with Bob Seidel. And it might have been at that point in time. And Judge Alessi and I were just chatting about Ed, and he said, you know, despite how difficult Ed can be in terms of his advocacy in front of the court, when he was first appointed as public defender, he really had not a lot of criminal defense experience at all. And he would come down as a public defender to Jamestown City Court, and whenever there was a misdemeanor case, he would demand a jury trial, and for a year, he had a jury trial for virtually every single misdemeanor that the public defender got appointed to that he could get to in order to develop his skills. Yeah. So he worked really hard to do it. Now, Ed had come out of Columbia and had worked with some New York City firms, but I don't think anybody down there did any kind of criminal work. Very bright guy. You know, everybody in the bar around here seemed to be very, very good and very bright. I had a really good friend in the Olean office of Saperston Day that we ended up working with, the Buffalo law firm, and he would always comment about how really good the bar in Jamestown was, the attorneys, compared to other places like Cattaraugus County or Allegheny County. But you know that because you've been here all this time.
Now, we recently interviewed Frank Pajano. I don't know if you saw that interview, but he talked about I think he's the guy that talked about a lineup one time, where he actually created a lineup in the middle of a trial. Were you part of that?
I don't remember that. Can you give me some more information on it? Maybe it'll...
somehow there was an identification issue, and...
oh, well, you know, we used to have situations...
In mid-trial, you sort of walked in with 4 people, and could you identify, you know, is the alleged perpetrator, and she pointed to that person when in fact the guy sitting there was the defendant.
It used to be fun to bring in other people and have them sit at the defense table and have them sit right next to you as defense counsel. We did that once or twice up there. I remember doing it for a speeding case in front of Bob Booty as a town justice in Lakewood, where I would put somebody next to me, and then, you know, it's been 4 or 5 months since the cop has seen the defendant, and the people sitting next to me all look kind of similar, you know, and okay, well, who is it? We tried it over at City Court, and after a while, Judge Alessi says, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. You know, the defendant has to identify himself as the defendant right now. You know,
oh, that's cool.
So that was kind of interesting. But
technique, yeah.
Yeah, but lots of interesting little strategies like that. There was I remember Leslie getting mad at me during one DWI trial over there, where in those days they used to charge you with 2 different counts of the DWI statute, violations of that statute. One of which was some sort of a breathalyzer test issue, and then something else. And somehow during the trial, it was obvious that they weren't going to be able to prove one of the aspects of the charges. And so I talked to the judge in chambers with Bob Seidel, and we had one of those charges dismissed, and came out, and it was no longer in front of the jury. We get the police officer on the stand, and first thing out of my mouth is, and do you know that the prosecution has agreed to dismiss one of the charges that you charged my client with? And Leslie just blew up. He says, "Whoa, hold it, get the jury out of here," you know. And he was really mad at me. He said, "That's really clever, but I mean, we're not going to put up with that kind of stuff either." You know, so you do whatever you can in court. Excellent trial attorneys around. Art Bailey, of course, you know, brilliant guy. No, I don't think a lot of people talk about Art for some reason. He's given a lot of people a lot of very difficult times in different cases. But if you wanted a guy that was willing to create chaos through technicalities in the law, and argue all of that, and create appeals, no matter how you felt about Art and why he was doing or what he was doing, he was really brilliant at that sort of tactic. So we had a good group up there in the public defender's office. After a few years, it was time to kind of expand my portfolio of lifetime learning and start to get into other things. In 1981, I think it was, the fall of '81, Jim Abdella had left Johnson, Peterson, Tiener, and Anderson, and had been acquired by Saperston Day, a large Buffalo law firm that represented a number of the banks up there. That was after he had run for Congress against Stan Lundeen and had lost against Stan. Felt that his becoming political at that point in time had harmed his client base, but he was really one of the brilliant attorneys out of Johnson, Peterson, Tiener, and Anderson. You know, came out of William and Mary, and went on to Michigan Law School. Great business lawyer, great with tax returns, great with complex business arrangements. Represented Burt Rappel and the doctors down in the WCA area when they were creating these partnerships for these buildings, these medical buildings that WCA was creating at that point in time. But Saperston was looking to expand, so they created an office here over on Spring Street, which still exists. Spent a lot of money to build it out, and Jim needed somebody to kind of take care of litigation work, so my dad had been using Gordon Erlinson, a CPA in Faulkner. Gordon knew Jim was looking. He linked us up. We had lunch over the old Holiday Inn up here, and I went up to Buffalo after Jim recommended me. Talked to Don Day and to Larry Gallick up in the Liberty Building at that point in time, which is where Saperston Day was, up on, I don't know what floor, the 12th floor. Beautiful views at that point. And they hired me. And Jim and I were together for 3 or 4 years over there. And I started to do a lot of different things with him. Again, reinventing myself. Lanny Sheffield had taught me how to do bankruptcy, had taught me how to do real estate. Jim taught me how to engage in the business aspects of law. The business agreements that you had to create at the same time that I was doing some of the litigation for him. And then Jim left the firm, came over to the Hotel Jamestown. His son Stephen came back into town and joined him over there. I think they're right on the same floor level as Bill Blood at that point in time. And I stayed in my spot. We had Gold
You were
Dome.
still with Saperson, right?
I was still with Saperson. We had the Gold Dome Bank business. They wanted me to continue to do all of the closings. And this, for the young attorneys watching, there's constant changes in the law, constant changes in what we have to do as attorneys. You got to be willing to bite the bullet and spend a lot of time learning how to do all that stuff. Not only is it in the substantive area of law, but it's also in the technical aspects of things, whether it's the computers or whatever. At that point, Gold Dome Bank was starting to employ bank attorneys. Saperson was their sole exclusive bank attorney up in the Buffalo area, so they had us doing that here, and I continued to do that after Jim left. Ed Wagner and Jack Hart over in Olean were doing it over there. They were doing this, they opened up an office in Syracuse, they opened up an office in Garden City, Long Island, and we're doing all of this type of banking work because Gold Dome and the other banks were starting to become regional banks. And they wanted to have familiar attorneys take care of their work. I think Fred Wolf was doing all of that work for Saperson up in Buffalo at that point in time. I think Fred went on to the circuit court position up there. Did he become circuit court judge at some?
I think so, yeah.
think he might have.
Yeah.
So we continue to do a large volume of that type of work, and those were the days when we had moved on beyond the 3 pieces of paper when you and I came into town in 77, 78, 76, whenever, and were able to close a real estate deal with a deed and a mortgage and a note. You know, now the federal government was coming in and they were requiring through the Housing and Urban Development group HUD-1 forms. Bob Asansny, one of the partners, would sit up there at Saperson's office and close 8 to 10 closings a day up in Buffalo and have to literally handwrite all these HUD forms at the closing table while the attorneys are sitting there waiting to sign all the documents and to get them over to the Erie County Clerk's office. And then beyond that, we started to go into truth in lending disclosure statements where you had to do calculations. And thank God Texas Instruments came along with a little calculator that you could actually calculate the effective interest rate on the borrower's loan, because at that point in time there was no way to do it. We didn't have the computers, we didn't have the software. Eventually we just were tortured and forced to start buying computers and software updates. At least we could buy it at that point in time. Now you can't even buy the software. Now you got to lease it on the web somewhere or up in the cloud. So anyway, real estate became very complex, complicated, and toward the end of my general practice over here, it seemed like real estate was a constant battle, and I think a lot of attorneys got out of it. I really loved going to Saperson Day because primarily they gave me a lot more money, and they also gave me health insurance, which at that point in time, health insurance started to go up 8% a year. And if you were a sole practitioner in a small town like Jamestown with a declining population, you know, it just wasn't possible for you to provide family health insurance. After Saperson and I separated, about 86 or so, we got involved with Richard Alexander, who you knew, who at one point in time was the executive director for the Chautauqua County IDA. Okay. Richard, his wife and my wife were good friends from our kids going to school together up in Chautauqua. Richard asked me to, first of all, come in and create some centennial corporation for the city of Jamestown. It must have been their 150th and centennial or something, so I did that. Then he was starting to progress through a not-for-profit community action organization that was created by Judge Joe Gerasi, by one of the other judges that was at that point in time, a kind of a group of the leaders in Chautauqua County who felt that there was a need to address the poverty issues in Chautauqua County. Richard took over Chautauqua Opportunities. He started to grow that organization from just a a food handout organization at the local food banks to other aspects such as Head Start, and then acquisition of real property for rental, and also weatherization projects. Now they have 20 different programs, federal programs going, in a $17 million a year budget. So I grew with them over a quarter of a century, maybe 35 years, and had to educate myself every day about a new federal program and new regulations, which were voluminous, and give advice on all the aspects that a corporation needed help with, which was contract work, labor law. The state started to provide for human resource discrimination, or human rights discrimination cases. We had to deal with those issues. Head Start was a big deal for Chautauqua Opportunities. But that board had about 15 people on it, and when Richard left, there was one interim, and then Roberta Keller came in, who had been working previously for Chautauqua Opportunities. Roberta really started to develop the networking concept. She networked with everybody in the county that she could. The county executive's office would appoint a couple of people to the board who were elected representatives. We'd have the sheriff, Joe Gerasi Jr., was on the board for years and years. All of the superintendents of schools were on the board. And it was a tripartite board under the federal regulations, where you'd have community members being a third of the board, you would have elected officials being a third of the board, and other business people being a third. They also got into developing the Chautauqua Opportunities for Development, Inc., which was gathering monies as a community foundation for lending purposes. I can't remember the exact acronym that the U.S. Treasury Department uses, but your good buddy Rich Dixon was on the board for that, and a lot of other bankers trying to come up with ways to give money to startup people, whether it was a single individual looking to work out of their home, or other folks where the normal banks, the commercial banks, would not lend, where the IDA was not involved because it was too small a situation. And so they're still doing that. And that was the days when small business incubators used to start up. And then the county got into small business incubators with Fredonia State up in Dunkirk. All of that was going on. So we handled all of that work, and I had thousands of files on, not thousands, but hundreds of files. They also created apartments where we started to get into tax credit situations. They created apartments up in Fredonia that were being leased to young women who were single moms, and then other low-income people on right off of Central Avenue, right up by Fredonia State. So that was Chautauqua Opportunities. Now, and probably 23 to 4 years ago, there was a little bit of a shake-up in the town of North Harmony, where Bill Reynolds came on as a supervisor. And Bruce Skolton, and he decided that Bruce would no longer be the town attorney. So Bill Reynolds, through a recommendation by Dale Robbins, who I had known from the old Dairy Queen days, when Dale used to work for the Super Duper store across the street, and the produce department would sell us bananas for banana spillet sales, So he worked for a guy by the name of Monty, who was the produce manager, selling us, he and my dad used to deal all the time. Dale recommended me to Bill Reynolds, who lived down the street. Bill was, at that time, had just come out of the Jamestown Police Department, I think, had just retired at that point. And we chatted about it. Bill had a vision for North Harmony. We talked, and he brought me on. And so for the next... I started 25 years ago to start to re-educate myself again into municipal law, whether it was the labor issues for the town, whether it was, we didn't get sued very often, whether it was tax issues. We had to start at that point in time I had to start doing a lot of zoning work. Every month I would be with the Zoning Board of Appeals. We started to grow with the state of New York because the state at that point had created the New York State Environmental Assessment Form. Seeker, State Environmental Quality Review Act. So Seeker has become a monster in New York State, whether it's for business development, or whether it's for brownfields or reclamation, whether it's for little townships to try to understand how they should address environmental issues in the state. And the environmental assessment forms are long, they're somewhat complicated. If you happen to get into projects like we did in North Harmony with cell towers, we had to bring in University of RIT professors to represent the town on the engineering aspects of cell towers. We had to deal a lot more with the New York State DEC when it came to things like proposals to build 2 10-story hotel motels that your partner Adam Walters represented Mr. McGraw out of Warren about, or whether it was Neil Robinson coming over from across the lake where he represented the town of Ellery and trying to get us to allow him and his client to build an asphalt plant right next to Hogan's Hut up in Stowe, New York. So that brought me into I'd always done a lot of night court work. This brought me into a lot of public hearings with landowners who didn't like zoning, especially along the lake. The people that came in from Cleveland and Pittsburgh that were tearing down the little cottages, wanted to build McMansions, and they wanted to be right on the line, didn't care about setbacks, didn't want anybody from walking down the road behind them to see the lake. A lot of extremely contentious public hearings. So you have to develop, if you didn't have it, you had to develop a real thick skin when it came to dealing with the public. A lot of screaming and hollering. We had great volunteers in North Harmony. When I finally retired, I sent them a letter and made a list of about 40 different volunteers that had allowed me to represent them as they served on boards of zoning boards or planning boards or boards of assessment review. And we had to deal with the town highway people and all of the issues that highway employees seem to run into occasionally. That allowed me to interact with the county planning department, county law department a lot. I used to deal with Steve Abdella frequently and a number of the other people up there. So that was 21 years of municipal law. That kind of gave me a little bit of a background where I never had engaged in any kind of publicity for myself. Never went on TV, wasn't a Celino and Barnes advertising. Finally put up a one-sheet page on the internet without anybody commenting about it that kind of listed what I had done previously. And toward the end of my career, I was fortunate to have an Alabama developer who was involved with building out Dollar General stores all around central and western New York. I was able to represent them, which was a great client. Again, lots of zoning, lots of environmental work, a lot of litigation, including appeals to the appellate division, and they essentially were the type of people that once they found the attorney that they wanted in the state that they wanted you to go everywhere. So they were asking me to review things from Rochester all the way down to Ithaca. Of course, my wife had retired at this point in time. We didn't think it was good for me to be traveling overnight and staying overnight too much at different places, but I was able to at least deal with a lot of things up in Erie County. I would drive up and drive back in one evening up in, a lot of work up in East Aurora and the town of Wales, up in Gwanda, and some around this area also. And then it came time to have a serious discussion with myself about, is there something that your life can provide you, or something that you would be willing to explore other than continuing to grind it out, which for you people watching was a wonderful experience, and you should do it. If you have a chance, just be flexible and be willing to work, and put up with the public as much as you have to put up with, and also feel great about helping the little old ladies, and people coming back to you and thanking you for things that you have done that you never even thought about that it was any big deal, but yet it turned out to be a remarkable benefit to those individuals. We get kind of jaded with all of the people that we see and all the things we do and the repetition of things that we do, but people really need a lot of help, and in a small general practice where you're not specializing like people have to do in the bigger cities, you have that opportunity. And if you can live relatively frugally within your budget and take these cases that are not going to pay well, but you do it because you feel an obligation to the profession, an obligation to these people, and the fact that we have a monopoly still with our licenses, and we do have an obligation to take care of folks to the extent that we can. Now, I know that there's a lot of pro bono, big firm type of programs where they want their attorneys to go out and do some pro bono work. In a small town like Jamestown, a lot of what you do is pro bono. So whether you help to volunteer over at the New York Law Center or whatever you do, you're going to end up helping people a lot in a lot of different ways. And I assume that you've had somewhat similar. Your experience was a little bit different coming into a corporate office as opposed to going up to public defender work like I did when I came back into town. And you had some great attorneys with Sherry Cadwell and Bob Sharp. And as I mentioned to you before, I came into this conference room, maybe 4 or 5 years ago to try to pick Sherry Cadwell's memory about some real estate over on the other side of Chautauqua Lake over by Driftwood, and I asked him at that point in time, well, how long did it take you to get used to being retired? And he looked at me and he said, about 30 seconds.
Yeah. And when he retired, he did it cold turkey, and I would have never in a million years thought he could do it because he was so personal. That was his spree, was dealing with people all the time. All of a sudden,
well, one of obviously our biggest issue is, and has been for me, is that I really haven't experienced retirement yet because of this COVID-19 pandemic. So for the last year and a half, I guess it was fortuitous that I retired when I did, because I no longer had to deal with the public. I could stay at home, we could isolate, we could keep ourselves healthy. I isolated, my family isolated in different cities, and just now, hopefully, we're starting to come out of that a little bit more. You and I are sitting here talking without masks on only because we've been able to be vaccinated. But that's a continuing issue, and what I saw in the new, thank God for the new generation of attorneys who live on social media and the internet. In our day, we never would have been able to get out to the bar all of the daily or twice a day new rules that the court administration is saying, this is what you've got to do now if you come up to the courts. Or you can't do this, you can't pursue a foreclosure, or you can't pursue an eviction. You got to wear your mask here, you don't have to wear it there. I mean, daily emails coming out from these guys. I don't know what else they do in life, but at least we get emails, and thank you to them I don't know whether any of them are pursuing general practices anymore like you and I did. Hopefully there will be some of those people out there. Now, when I failed to mention that when I was in my second year of law school, all through college, I had graciously been granted the opportunity to work for the Jamestown Labor's Union. So I worked for Ludwig Construction doing heavy labor all summer. Each of my college years and during the Christmas holidays when I would come home, we built Blackstone down there, and we did I was on the 3rd Street Bridge when we ripped all the concrete off the 3rd Street Bridge and re-poured that. But after I did that my first summer of law school, but my second summer of law school, I thought I needed a little bit of experience, so I did come back, and I did work with Park Catchpole and Walt Donovan, who were sharing space over at the Hotel Jamestown building, I think just down the hall from Spoto's office. Yeah. And that was nice. Those guys were great. Park was an assistant DA at that point. He asked me to do research for him and to write memorandums or to help him on motions that were being provided for motions to dismiss by defense counsel. And Walt was a great guy. I think he represented my parents on a couple of different matters. But I was always amazed. I'd go to work, and then at noontime would come around, and the door would close, and nobody would come back for an hour and a half. And it was 1:30 in the afternoon. I'm saying, where is everybody? You know, aren't they supposed to be working? So that was kind of an interesting view into the local bar here compared to the big city firms and, you know, open 24/7. But I also learned how to appreciate our paralegals and our secretaries at that point too, because Park Catchpole would walk out through the main office. He would look over at Jean Berg, who was his secretary at that point in time before she became the court stenographer, and he would say, "Jean, on that Johnson case, prepare that warranty deed for me. You know, I'll be back in a little while," and just walk out the door. And I'm going, what? How does Jean know how to prepare a warranty deed? You know, so I learned to really appreciate the fact that our paralegals really made us in many, many ways. They did all the work on all of the paper, heavy labor-intensive real estate practice. I had to get out of bankruptcy practice; it was too labor-intensive. And thank God that they were great women that worked for us, and it was a pleasure to know a lot of them. So, and
David, as a sole practitioner most of your career, was there somebody in the bar that was kind of your go-to person when kind of the issue was raised and kind of you picked up the phone and said, "Hey, I got this issue"?
Well, because of my Saperston, I started to work with Saperston Day. Jim Abdella, as I mentioned, had hired me away. When they expanded, Ed Wagner ended up in Olean with Jack Hart, and Ed and I had a very close working relationship. Ed was a graduate of Notre Dame Law School. He had been an assistant U.S. attorney up in Buffalo for 4 or 5 years. He was a partner with Saperston Day in the litigation area doing defense work for all of the insurance companies that they represented. And he and I, for virtually our entire career, would talk about cases. And we would brainstorm, because I had nobody really to brainstorm with. He did a lot of conflict stuff for me. I did some for him. But when it came down to many of the litigation matters that I didn't want to move into, because I couldn't really run a litigation practice while I'm trying to do a massive real estate practice or a massive corporate practice, plus the municipal law for North Harmony, plus all the corporate work for COI. there's just not enough hours in the day. So if you have to go up to Mayville and pick a jury and you're out of your office for 4 or 5 days, the rest of your practice is down the tubes. So Ed took over a lot of that stuff for me, which was great. So he and I did a lot of that stuff together. Earlier on, it was Jim Abdello when I had issues there. I interacted a lot with the CPAs in town when we were doing estate work, probate work. If we were doing 706 estate tax returns or whatever, toward the end of my career, I had to deal with them because all of those returns had become so complicated with their schedules that you had to purchase, $800 to $1,000 licenses yearly for the software that would allow you to prepare the return. You could not do it by hand as you used to do. Now, the reason why I know some of that is because at one point in time, after Jim Abdella had left, I was walking down the street here, happened to see Neil Robinson, and he's just moaning and fretting about the fact that he's only got a few hours left and he's got to get a brief into the appellate division. He just doesn't know what he's going to do, and he's just burned out and tearing his hair out. Well, shortly thereafter, we were talking, and he and Bob, who were on the first floor of the Hotel Jamestown, as you walked in the lobby, had to leave. And so they came over to my office. And Greg and Bob Booty was in one corner. Neil was in the other. And they were there for 3 or 4 years. And I used to quiz Bob Booty repeatedly about a lot of things. And he was a great resource. Neil was a great resource. You learned how to really start to connect to other attorneys in other practices. And now over the last 15 years, you've seen that a lot with these types of relationships have kind of become semi-formal with a lot of the firms where they start to advertise, we have 200 attorneys and we can do anything for you that you want. And our attorneys are all over the country. And of course, they're affiliated. They're not in the same office, they're not doing that, but they have worked out some sort of a referral arrangement, and they start to promote themselves under an umbrella of the same name, okay? So they do that in the big cities now. We just would call up our colleagues, and we would ask them those questions. Again, Jim, Ed, I learned a lot, as I said, from Fagan and from Lanny, even though I fought with Ed Fagan on a number of litigation and things after that. So Mike Corey came into my office after Booty and Robinson left, and they came over to the Fenton building. Were there for 5 or 6 years before Bob got out altogether, and Neil went over to Pheasant and Laumer and D'Angelo. Mike came in. He was on my zoning board of appeals up in North Harmony, and he had been in the Hotel Jamestown with Mr. Rhodes, and he had been handwriting all of this stuff. So I kind of grew with Mike as he, really brilliant kid, came out of our school with us a year after we did, out of Jamestown High School. He started to get into the technology. He helped me with a lot of technology. He started to have to purchase the software that was required to do all of this tax stuff. So to a certain extent, I was able to work off the coattails of these individuals and in fact engage them in the preparation of different tax forms later on in my career. But that gave me an opportunity to do work. Now, one thing I guess I would suggest to your audience here for the younger people is that you had to engage in a leap of faith about your own skills and what you could really do, because you still have an obligation to provide a professional, negligence-free type of service. So those of us who would be sole practitioners would look around and say, well, where's the business going to be a year or 2 or 3 or 4 years from now? What do I have to do in terms of continuing legal education? Do I want to take a criminal course or a municipal law course or a UCC course? Do I go up to Buffalo and listen to Hodge and Russ expound on municipal law things? Or do I go up and start learning about labor law? And you also had to spend money on technology that would allow you the opportunity to offer your services to prospective clients. Now, one big example that we had on a regular basis was we had to buy HUD type of software and disclosure software. And then I had to have my paralegal train on that software for weeks and weeks at a time. But when the bank did call, we were able to say, we can do that work. Sure. And you did a great job, you got it done. My paralegals took care of taking care of all of the hard software stuff, and we looked like we were still professionals in that particular area of law. So that's a very, it's a difficult, but something that you've got to be willing to do. A lot of people aren't willing to do that. They want to specialize. And it's easier to specialize to a certain extent because you just do the same thing over and over again. You update yourself a little bit every year with some kind of reference to what's going on in the federal law. But Don Day, in his various speeches to the Stapleton Day attorneys at various functions, first of all would get up and say, reach for the brass ring. It's there if you want it. You know, so you young guys, if you really want to work hard and make sure that that the cash flow runs through the partners, reach for that brass ring. And the good attorneys are not mistake proof, but they limit their mistakes. So acknowledge your mistake immediately, take care of it, and cure the problem immediately, because it only gets worse if you try to hide it. So Don would give us those speeches, and you kind of had to accept that as a way of life, you know. Go for it. I can't remember what your question was.
No, it's so fascinating because, David, the reality is you've given a tutorial on a career arc in the practice of law in Chautauqua County over this past 40 years, and how you've been able to, in many senses, be a renaissance man within the profession. You know, you've readapted yourself, you've anticipated changes perhaps in the winds of the law, and also when opportunity presented itself, you jumped on it, were willing to learn. I mean, it's really quite a tutorial for anybody who's going to watch this. This is not sit back, relax, and react. You were proactive.
Well, full disclaimer, Jamestown has shrunk in size. I don't know how much general work is available anymore. I personally had my children, because of the cost of education, move out to larger cities. Sure. One in Cleveland, one in Pittsburgh, and one in DC. So, but there is still, I believe, from what I see and hear, enough work in this city that if you're willing to accept the fact that the quality of life here is still can be great and provided to you, as in my case, I spent a lot of time leaving work at 4 o'clock to go watch my children play soccer and run track and do other things. If you're willing to accept the reduced revenue issues and still be able to practice law and still be able to pursue your children as they're growing up, then it's truly a wonderful thing. Ed Wagner used to always ask me, David, if you had your chance, would you have done anything differently? And I said to him, no, I don't think so. I think I'm relatively intelligent and understand myself that if I really had wanted to do anything differently and was terribly dissatisfied, I would have made those choices and I would have moved on. But I've been in other parts of the country, I practiced in other parts of the country, and this turned out to be pretty nice. So, good luck.
With that, we stand adjourned.
Okay.